Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the second installment of our Plan D, What to Do After the PhD series that we've been running here at the Comparative Literature Institute of the University of Porto. Last semester, I did a series of conversations with my colleague Marinela Freitas, who will not be here with me this semester. What we're going to do here that's going to be different from what we did before is that, first of all of the conversations will be in English, right? So hopefully we can reach other people outside of Portugal and Brazil and whatnot. And you know, since this is such a pressing topic, I'm sure there will be a lot of people interested in what our guests have to say. I also envision this being more focused on writing practices and research methods than what we did before, which was more focused on awards and scholarships, fellowships, and whatnot that were specific to Portugal and Europe. So this is again going to be more. This is going to be a little broader and at the same time more focused on specific, particular ways of approaching research. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome Shosuke Kinugawa and have him as my first guest on the show. He was my colleague at the University of Buffalo. And so it's a great pleasure to have him and to talk to him again. I'm going to just introduce him very briefly and then start asking him some questions. He is currently an associate professor in the Department of English Studies at Kobe City University of Foreign Studies in Japan. He is currently writing a book based on his dissertation, which discusses Mark Twain's literature in the context of his interests in wordplay and encoded writing. Shosuke has an article forthcoming in the Mark Twain Journal next spring on this topic. He also has published articles in journals like Narrative and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Review. Another important thing, since we're going to be, talking a lot about the dissertation, right, and how to write a dissertation and whatnot, it's important to note that Shosuke has a PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and he was awarded with a very prestigious dissertation award, and he got a bunch of important fellowships while he was a student there. So which is all very important, right? Especially since we're going to be focusing on this early stage of one's career. So welcome, Shosuke. And
great to be here.
So, again, we're going to start by focusing on the dissertation, right?
Okay.
And so the first question I wanted to ask you is, did you, since I know that you're now still in the process of turning the dissertation into a book, did you envision the whole thing, right, the whole project as a book from the beginning?
Right. Yes and no. I mean, so for me, writing the dissertation was always a process towards writing a book. So I never envisioned the dissertation as something standalone. It was a requirement for getting a PhD, but it was at the same time also a draft, so to speak, for my book that I wanted to write on Mark Twain. So, I mean, to put it differently, it didn't really matter very much for me whether the dissertation was perfect or great or whatnot, because I knew that I'd go on and revise. So the dissertation itself, when I submitted it, wasn't perfect, right? But it was a dissertation. So I was happy with it as such. Yeah, so I was aware that I wasn't writing a dissertation, right? And I knew that it wasn't the same thing as a book. So in that sense, I was, writing a dissertation, but also I had a vision of what I wanted to do with it after. So in that sense, it was, I was writing a book as I was writing the dissertation. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but just to insist a little bit on this issue, like, did you feel that you had still at that stage like a little more freedom to maybe explore things that maybe wouldn't fit in in a book, because the dissertation ultimately is maybe a more like exploratory and necessarily
Right.
digressive sort of exercise, right? Which and do you think that maybe those things paid off ultimately?
That's a good question. Yeah, so indeed, I thought a lot of the content of the dissertation to be, an experiment, as you say. So the way I wrote my dissertation was that I wasn't ever really aware of a deadline, right? So I finished in my 6th year, but it's not that I wanted to finish in my 6th year. So I had a cycle where I would read the text, in my case, Mark Twain's, mainly his fiction, take notes, organize, right? And then write them out as an essay, and then sort of find something wrong or have another idea that I wanted to explore, or so on and so forth. And then I'd go back to taking notes, right? And then I just kept doing that. And then when I had enough material to submit as a dissertation, I just submitted it as a dissertation. So in that process, yeah, there was a lot of trial and error, scrap and build, so a lot of the stuff that I had originally conceived of as the core of my dissertation just went out the window in the process. And it kind of grew into something else, or just disappeared altogether. So what resulted as my dissertation in the end was kind of like, I was aware that it was, still in the process of being formulated. And it was very sort of, to a certain degree, speculative, right? And also very in that, so I guess you could say it's experimental in that sense. But yeah, so when I finished my dissertation, and that was the state of the dissertation, and then when I sort of took it with me to my new job here and started reworking it, I realized that there are a lot of, I don't know, I realized that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of kind of basic research. Like I hadn't looked into this archive, I hadn't looked into this archive, this aspect of Twain's life, his work, and so on and so forth. So what I went and did was all these sort of ideas and arguments that looked speculative or experimental, so to speak. I went and did more research on that, and then tried to see what would happen in terms of the sort of quality of the argument. Is it just going to be really speculative in the end? So should I just throw it out, or can I keep this, right? So yeah, so in the dissertation, I kind of created a lot of kernels, which I went on to grow, so to speak. And right now I'm in the process of kind of weeding out the stuff that just remained speculative until now, which I think I can't really use. Yeah. So yeah, the dissertation definitely had a lot of sort of experimental, speculative aspects to it.
Yeah. No, I think that's very useful. Even for someone that's still at that stage of writing a dissertation to know that maybe you're not going to be able to, tie all those loose ends right now. Maybe that's something that needs to be, or that can be addressed later down the line. So that's a very useful piece of advice, I think, or a useful remark in any case. So another thing I wanted to ask you about the dissertation is how did you come up with this topic in particular of Mark Twain's secret writings? I believe that was the title of your,
Yeah.
of your dissertation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So how did you come up with this idea in particular, and how did you realize that this was worth doing a dissertation on? When did you feel that you had enough material, or that things were in place that would allow you to make this into a large scale or long-term project? So say a little bit about the process as a whole, if you don't mind.
Okay. So what the sort of original idea, and I actually remember quite vividly when I first sort of thought up of conceived this idea. So it was during my MA master's, and there was a class on Mark Twain, and I was reading Adventures of Tom Sawyer, right? And I realized that there's a lot of references to things like ciphers and mysteries and codes and stuff like that. And it was all framed within this sort of context of children's play. So Tom Sawyer is pretending to hunt for treasure, and there's this sort of cipher map that he's using and stuff like that. But it's the sort of references to codes and ciphers and whatnot was so pervasive that it just kind of stuck with me. And I realized that maybe this is something that isn't just a sort of stage prop to depict childishness, so to speak, right? The childlike childishness of Tom Sawyer and the kids and so on and so forth. Maybe something deeper is going on, right? So I think that was my first sort of sense that codes and wordplay and stuff like that might be really important for Twain. But in my MA thesis, where I also worked with Mark Twain, I didn't really go into it because it sounded so weird, or like such a sort of, it didn't sound like a very mainstream topic to work with, right? So I just left it, kind of. I weaved it in a little bit, but it wasn't really the main of a mess. But it stuck with me, and when I went to Buffalo, in SUNY Buffalo, and started working on my PhD there, I took the time to work with that idea, doing an independent study with Professor Neil Schmitz, who is a Twain scholar. And the more I sort of read into Twain and more I worked with his writings, the more evidence of his interest on this topic accumulated. And I don't know exactly when I decided, but at some point I just realized that this is something that I can develop into an actual project that will probably shed some, some aspect of, it'll probably shed some new light on some aspect of Twain's writing. I don't know if it'll be that significant, but it's worth pursuing, right? Is the process. So it was really just me kind of pursuing my interest in this sort of theme that kept popping up in Twain's writing, and looking at it from different directions throughout my first and second year of graduate school, PhD. And then when it, came to proposing my dissertation project, I had a lot of material that suggested this was a good this was a neglected but important aspect of Twain's writing. But I didn't have sort of a coherent line of argument that proved its significance. In other words, I couldn't contextualize it in a way that showed its value in terms of understanding Twain. But I just went to my chair, Professor Carrie Brahman, and just told her, okay, I'm thinking of writing about Mark Twain and ciphers. And this was interesting because when I finished my dissertation and I had my defense, we went out to eat pizza with my chair and committee. And I asked her, how did you feel when I proposed to you my idea? And did you think I was crazy? And she said yes, without missing a beat, right? So, and I was aware that it sounded very sort of dangerous, like it sounded like a conspiracy theory. But I had a chair who was willing to sort of take on this weird project, and so I worked on it and just went out and looked for. At once, I looked for evidence. Right? I went to archives. I went through his writing, but I also, thought about the whole topic in terms of different genres, right? Like detective fiction, which encoding plays an important part. I looked at humor, so literary riddles, word games. So I kind of ventured into different areas and then came back. Then looked at Twain again. And so it was kind of a sort of a cycle of departing and coming back. And looking at Twain's work from different sort of perspectives until I could see, without kind of bending myself backwards, so to speak, and making convoluted arguments, that, okay, this is what wordplay and encoded is doing in Twain's writings, right? And that just basically took 6 years, right? So that's kind of the trajectory that my dissertation took, right? It's not a very coherent trajectory. I didn't have any sort of, so let's say I didn't choose any theoretical underpinning, right? Well, I didn't choose any specific theme to look through in terms of understanding Twain. It was more like there was a lot of weird things going on in Twain's writings. How can I explain this, right, on its own terms, right? And then, so just the way I went about it became very eclectic. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I did it.
No, I mean, no, it does. And it's interesting that, because I do feel that, that moment you described of having, a bunch of maybe, a bunch of pieces that maybe don't fit very well and that can force you to make as you said, convoluted arguments. I think that, at least, speaking for myself and, from people I know that also, went through the same process, it is an issue, right? Like to make it all, fall into place and to make, as you said, to find a line of argument that doesn't really force you to right. Sort of impose your argument on the text or on the materials. So as you said, right, like that maybe takes a lot of time and it is a bit of a gamble ultimately, right? So that's
definitely, yeah.
What I wanted to ask you is that, did you have like other ideas at the time, so other projects that might have been the focus of your dissertation?
Like
had this one, yeah. Had this one
no.
not worked? No.
No, I didn't have a backup. Yeah, no, it was a total gamble. It was yeah, in retrospect, I think I was aware that it was a gamble. And I don't really understand why that wasn't really an issue for me. But it was a risk that I was taking. Yeah. So what I was doing throughout the PhD program was I was really aware of the job market here in Japan, right? And here, you need 3 publications for you to find an entry-level job, right? Straight out of PhD. So I didn't want to look like I could only do Twain. So I published on various other authors like Fitzgerald and Lisa May Alcott and stuff like that. So I guess you could say those were kind of backups, right? But I just never really thought of them as backups. But it wasn't like I was only thinking about Twain the whole time. There were other sort of projects in mind that I was working with at the same time. So maybe if if this Twain project didn't work out, I would have worked with those. I was also working with detective fiction, so maybe I would have gone there. But I didn't really think of any sort of backup plans for this project. I don't know why. Maybe it was because, like I said, I wasn't really thinking about it in terms of a hard deadline. I had this feeling that, even if it turned out that I was making only a really minor point, right, I would be able to kind of formulate an argument that is of value to Twain's studies, at least based on what I have accumulated, right? So yeah, it was definitely a gamble, but no, I didn't think of a backup plan. Yeah.
That actually, I think what you were saying about it being a gamble, you taking, even though to sort of comment on what you're saying, that you didn't have a hard deadline, right? That you didn't really feel that pressured ultimately to come up with something next week or something like that. So that maybe did allow you to explore a little and take some chances. What I wanted to ask you is that might relate to that, is because you did get it did work, and you did get a lot of awards and whatnot, and especially at the end you did get a very prestigious dissertation award. So what I wanted to ask you is, in your estimation, like, what do you think at the end of the day made your dissertation exceptional?
Okay.
In your opinion.
No, I don't know that's a hard one. So obviously I wasn't expecting to win an award for my dissertation. But I guess everyone is more skeptical about what they've written than anyone else.
Right.
But to try to answer that question, so I was, from the beginning to the end, I was really skeptical about my project, right? I was worried that I was forcing my interests and theories and ideas onto Twain's text. And I was just kind of building this sort of, theoretical sandcastle around Twain and wanting it to sound like it's actually there. Especially since my work was about things like codes and, ciphers and hidden wordplay and stuff like that, which already sounds very, kind of wishy-washy, so to speak.
Right.
So I was extremely careful not to sound like I was imposing my ideas and forcing it onto Twain's text. So I did a lot of sort of, my revision was mainly motivated by that anxiety, right? So I wasn't really aiming to make big claims, interesting claims, and so on and so forth. I just wanted to make claims that were based on what Twain was writing and try not to sound like I'm exaggerating something, right? So there's that. Like, I was just taking a lot of time trying to make arguments that would sound as objective and convincing as possible for other people, right? So there's that. And then on the other hand, the entire premise of the project is, how should I put it? Eye-catching, surprising, it's novel. So like just a one-liner, right? Mark Twain's writing is encoded. That already at once sounds very, unconvincing, but also very sort of catchy, right? So I think that in the end, when that sort of surprisingness, that element, and the sort of anxiety about the convincingness of my arguments, when that combined, it turned out well, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, it was maybe that turned out as a dissertation that gave the impression of originality, right? So yeah, that's all I can say about that. But again, so it was a very literary project, right? It was just on Mark Twain, a single author study on a white 19th century male author working with his texts and his archives, whereas the committee of that award, the dissertation award, was very interdisciplinary, right? It wasn't just literary scholars, it was like historians. So yeah, I was very surprised, right? I thought my dissertation was a very kind of old school, not sexy at all, no theory at all. Theory, wasn't a part of it. So I wasn't expecting anything like that getting awarded. So I was kind of just, pleasantly surprised that an interdisciplinary panel came in and looked at it and thought it was good. So
no, but it does speak to the method, right, that you were sort of describing, of at the same time having your eyes on something that was catchy, original, and the whole like the more laborious part of the process of like making sure that everything actually coheres and makes sense and is understandable to a general audience and whatnot. So I think that's regardless of whether it's sexy or not, right? It's just good science, maybe, right? Good research, right? And that's that's probably what was being acknowledged in my.
Right. And so since you mentioned that this, you wanted to talk about the writing process, there's another thing that I took care to do was to write in a way that was, people say this all the time, jargon free, right? Not no complex, unnecessarily complex rhetoric and so on and so forth, right? That's something, because you realize that even if you're a good writer, right, you sometimes realize that you're making leaps of logic, you're sort of filling in gaps in logic with rhetoric. You got to catch that, right? So I just kind of really tried hard to write in a way that sort of reflected logical consistency, right? Which I thought would then translate into clarity, right? So that was part of it, right? So I was trying to make sense of what I was thinking in my mind and making it clear and more logical as I wrote my prose, right?
Yeah, and especially, because it is as you were saying initially, right? It's also not just a matter, it is a matter of writing, as you're saying, like it is a matter of how you express the argument, how you put it in order, but it's also how you maybe collect and put the materials in conversation with each other, right? Because as you were saying at the beginning, right, at the end of the day, the puzzle kind of made sense, right? Initially, maybe you weren't convinced yourself that there was something there. But now you are convinced, I assume. So, and
Right,
you have
right.
convinced
Yeah, yeah.
others, right? So that's important as well, right? The fact, not just the writing maybe, but the fact that you have materials in your hand, right? So maybe there is a more like historiographical as well, like part of the work, or as you were saying, like archival, right? The kind of archival work that you needed to do was also meticulously done, right? And you yourself said that even nowadays you find yourself, trying to, tie
Right,
loose
right.
ends from the dissertation, right? Like things that maybe aren't really that convincing still, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I know. Another thing I wanted to ask you is about if looking backwards, right, retrospectively, is there something that you wish you had known, back then, that would have maybe, saved you time, saved you trouble,
Mhm.
or are you still maybe as in the dark now as you were before, or
About the writing
about
process.
research, right? Writing process, yeah,
Right, right,
about
right.
doing research in general.
Yeah, no, there's I think so. One major sort of hurdle, right, is when you're working with someone like Mark Twain, who already has a lot of scholarship done on him. It's very difficult to efficiently read through scholarship on him, right? There's literally, it feels like there's already everything written about him, right? There is multiple reference books, there's dictionaries, on top of all the critical work that people have done on his works and so on and so forth. And Twain himself was a very prolific writer. So, and this is something that I haven't quite figured out yet, but if I were to go back to when I was writing the dissertation, I would first try to learn, I don't know, a method, right? Maybe ask one of my committee members, or just read something specifically about how to engage with secondary sources and critical scholarship. So in a way that will let you at once obtain a general picture of what the scholarship looks like, and get you specifically to the vein of scholarship that you need to look into deeply to incorporate into your own writing, right? So the sort of methodology of treating the scholarship, that the pre-existing scholarship, is something that I would want to learn more about, right? And I still do, right? So that's one thing. Another sort of, I wish I had more formal training in archival work, right? So, like the nuts and bolts really kind of matter when you go into an archive. You take a camera, you take pictures of manuscripts, or you decode sort of handwriting, you communicate with archivists, that kind of thing. I wish I had taken a course or something, and it would have made really easier for me to at once access material that I wanted, and also to keep them organized, right? So archival work, training there. Yeah, and also then, and another thing is how to organize notes, right? This is really important, but it's very hard, especially when you probably have the same experience. Your kind of notes proliferate and just grow and grow, and then at some point you lose perspective, right? I don't remember what I said there. I don't remember what I said there. but I feel like it's important and yada, 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 right? So, figuring out a way to keep notes and to be able to keep track of the content in a meaningful way, right? That's the sort of skill that I wish I had more of a handle on when I was writing the dissertation. I think I'm getting better, right? It's still sort of a developing skill, but nonetheless, it was an issue when I was writing my dissertation. Yeah. So.
But have you come up with like new or different practices that make sense in terms of organizing notes? What do you do these days?
Right.
Like, how do you organize?
So one thing that I started doing that's different from my PhD days is that so during my PhD, I did everything mostly on Word using the outline function, right? So I would use the outline function, take notes, and then organize them, and then just when it just got too long, I would take the sort of kernels, the main ideas, move it to a new note and start it over, stuff like that. And then you had like 10 and 20 of the notes that you keep expanding and cutting off, and it was just becoming, I mean, it worked, but it was becoming very hard to sort of keep a grand map of my ideas. So one thing I started doing was using more visual notes, so to speak. So instead of typing everything, when I first start reading a novel, or when I really start engaging with a text, I handwrite now. I handwrite my notes, and then I would use color and draw things and try to visually conceptualize and design my thoughts, right? Because and I use a really big notebook so that I can kind of see my ideas visually, so to speak, right? So yeah, it's becoming more kind of hands-on, literally. Yeah, so it helps me because I feel like just typing as opposed to moving your hands and writing and drawing and engaging with the text in a different mode, so to speak, helps me memorize and organize better.
Excellent. Yeah, that's very useful, I think.
But it's not like an invention. It's just, you can kind of tell I'm still struggling with how to create a method that, is all encompassing, so to speak. Yeah.
Sure. No, but that makes perfect sense. I mean, I also like handwriting things and that, spatial. I remember like seeing, it was very funny to see your desk in school, because I remember you had a bunch of like Post-its and whatnot. So you clearly need that spatial maybe and visual element, right, to organize your ideas, to maybe put them in a scheme, right, and see them.
Yeah.
So that's nice. That's useful, I think. And having everything on the computer, maybe it works for you at least, right? It works for me as well. I also like to schematize, right, and have a map of what I'm trying to do. Yeah. Okay, I also wanted to ask you some things about your articles, right? In particular, you have, I mean, we've discussed this prior to the recording, but you in particular have an article in narrative, right? Which is, as we were saying before, right? Like, which is a very prestigious journal according to the rankings that are used. For example, and I was telling you this, right? Like when people apply for an award, for a fellowship here in European Union, those are the rankings that are taken into account, right? Like, but you were saying that that maybe this is not. But you'll speak about that. This is maybe not something you were saying that in the American job market, maybe it's not as prestigious as it appears. But in any case, right, it is a prestigious venue, and I wanted you to say a little about like what is special about this particular article in comparison to other publications that you have, and what did you think, or did you think that it would make it to a bigger, more prestigious venue, right? And why? Why did you think this article in particular was capable of making it, you know, to a better place, right? Let's say, or a more prestigious. Sorry, not better. You know, these are all very loaded terms, right? But to a more prestigious.
Right. All right. So
but sorry, Shosuke. Let me before you start, you know, start speaking. Say a little bit about the, you know, the method, right, of coming up with an idea for something like this, and, you know, coming up with an idea, you know, revision, the way you went about revising the article and whatnot. You know, say how, you know, what was the process like of getting this published?
Okay. So, I mean, in a sense, it's an offshoot of my research for the dissertation. My dissertation had a component, no, it was actually a chapter. There's a chapter in there on Mark Twain's detective fiction, right? And so in order to understand the sort of Mark Twain's detective fiction in the context of detective fiction, the genre, right, I had to go and read a lot of detective fiction and scholarship on that. And so in the process of doing that, I read, you know, from Sherlock Holmes to Poe to Agatha Christie to Dashiell Hammett and all those sort of detective fiction authors, and they in of themselves started becoming interesting. And I also learned that wordplay and codes are very much a part of the detective fiction genre too. So there was more of a sort of natural, so to speak, relationship between codes and ciphers and wordplay with detective fiction than Mark Twain, right? So at that point, I was like, oh, maybe I can do something with detective fiction and codes and wordplay because it's just all over the place, right? And so that was on my mind for a while. And at some point, I just decided that I wanted to do a project on detective fiction too, apart from Twain, right? And first I wrote an article on Poe, right? And then my second article was on Agatha Christie, which is the one that is published in Narrative. The one on Poe is, it is about genre in a sense, because Poe is considered, quote unquote, the father of modern detective fiction, but it's mainly just about how wordplay works in his short stories. So it doesn't have any sort of, it doesn't really have an appeal outside of Poe scholarship, at least an obvious appeal. But the Agatha Christie one is different in that I specifically make an intervention in the study of detective fiction as a genre, right? So the contribution that I propose is much more wide. So it's geared towards a wider audience. Anyone who is interested in detective fiction as a genre, maybe this would appeal to your interest, is the basic argument, the audience that I'm making my arguments towards. So I think that's one very important sort of aspect that you should keep in mind if you are trying to get published in journals that are considered big journals, like prestigious, big, and so on and so forth. So the sort of more famous, so to speak, more prestigious the journal is, they tend to want articles that aren't single author or single novel studies, or about, like a specific, very specific group of works or something like that, right? They want something that appeals to interdisciplinary audiences. You want an article that has a historical, theoretical significance on top of its contribution to an author scholarship ground. So the narrative article, I specifically wrote it so that I was making an argument not just about Agatha Christie and wordplay, but about how Agatha Christie's use of the wordplay helps us better understand this device in detective fiction, a common device called fair play, right? And I was saying how, okay, fair play has been discussed this way, but I think Christie's use of fair play in conjunction with wordplay, the use of fair play in conjunction with wordplay is a sort of way of using this device that shows us something new about how detective fiction works, right? So that's that sort of scope, the breadth and the scope has to be bigger, wider as the journals become better, so to speak. And this is something that is a pattern that I've noticed for a while, and I think a lot of people also are aware of, because there's a lot of journals, right? There's more of a sort of specific, there are a lot of journals that you can write single author or single work studies towards, right? So for example, if it's Mark Twain, if it's just on Mark Twain, I could just give it to the Mark Twain journal. And often if you send that article to a big journal, they'll just write back to you saying, I think this fits better in a author studies journal, right? So the journals themselves are also very aware of the scope of the audience that they're catering to, right? So so what I did was I just read through the author guidelines and also read their articles to see what kind of arguments and what kind of research that they are publishing, right? And then you get a sense of whether or not they would want an article like yours. So then you wouldn't be wasting your time. And then when I read narratives guideline and their articles, they often kind of published articles that were at once geared towards general arguments about genre and narrative, generally speaking, but also single author studies, right? Or single work studies. So I was like, oh, this might be a good fit, right? So I just sent it to them, not really thinking about whether they are a prestigious journal. I mean, that was a factor too, right? I knew that they were a good journal, but it was more about the fit, right, of my project than anything else.
Right.
So,
I mean, it does many times come down to that, right? Like whether or not it's what they're looking for. But in any case, I wanted to ask you, and especially since this is not an author. I mean, you have been reading Agatha Christie for your dissertation, but she was never your as you said, right? Like never your main focus, right? So how did you end up coming up with an idea, right? Because at the end of the day, sure, it has like general. It's an argument that has general significance, sure, but it's an argument that makes sense, right? And that works, and that is in conversation with some sort of tradition about, as you said, about detective fiction and fair play, right? So what do you think put you in a position to come up with this idea, right? That is, must have been a good idea, I guess, right? Do you think that maybe the work that you developed over time on detective fiction might have helped, right? So it's maybe, it might look like an offshoot of your dissertation project or a one-off, but maybe it's something that was in germination for a long time.
So I mean, it wasn't really in germination for a long time, but like I said, it is an offshoot of my interest in detective fiction that grew out of my dissertation, and there was already an article on Poe before this. But I guess I should emphasize that it's the same for my dissertation too. I don't know, I never write on anything based on like whether I want something to be published or this or that. I just try to write on a novel or a short story or whatever that genuinely interests me, if that doesn't sound too naive. And when I say interests me, I mean more like, does it at once confuse and excite me, right? So if that work has something in it that I don't understand, right? There's something there that confuses me. It's not, something that I can easily understand. But at the same time, it really sort of like is appealing, right? Intellectually or emotionally or whatever. So there's a sort of, there's at once that sort of enigma aspect to it. And then there's also this very strong interest that I have, this strong appeal that makes me feel like I want to understand it, right? So when there's that, basically my writing process and my thinking process is, okay, how do I understand this work, right? How do I solve all these things that I understand about it? I need to think up of a way to solve this, right? And then, a lot of times it doesn't really turn into an article, right? Because for it to become an article, there has to be a sort of social aspect to that interest that you have in your reading. That it can't be just, satisfies your criteria, right? You have to make an argument for why your sort of knowledge about it is worthwhile for others. So I have a lot of I have a lot of stuff that, I'm not going to turn into an article that I've kind of pursued, right? But the articles that, not the articles, the research that turn into articles are those that just happen to have, or just happen to turn out to have an appeal outside of my own interests. So I don't know if that's how people in general go around writing articles, but yeah, mine's just, my way of writing is that, what do I not understand about this work and how do I understand it? Yeah. And then whatever comes out, I find something, whatever comes out, if it fits a venue, then it goes there, is how I think about it.
Right. I mean, and in my, this is a more like personal comment, but in my experience, talking to you, I've always noticed that your way of working is more like bottom up, right? So you do,
oh yeah,
start with something, with a book, right? Rather than, let's say, as many other people do, they start with theory, with a certain concept or whatnot, but you always look for something interesting in the source material itself, right? In the novel, in a poem, and that's useful. Also, a useful way of building an argument, right? Because you're not, as we were saying at the beginning, you're sort of making sure that you're not, building sand castles or castles in the air, right? At the end of the day, right? And that's very important. If you want your argument to be convincing and coherent. So
yeah, I would add though that articles and research that comes out of this kind of thought process, they don't really make it into prestigious journals. It's not really what they want. If you go and read American literature or American literary history, critical inquiry, those really big top journals in American literary criticism, they're not really, interested in specific arguments about specific aspects of a specific novel or something like that, right? Not even 2 or 3, right? It's more about, it makes larger claims about history and race and so on and so forth, that are in of themselves very interesting, right? But it's not the way my research works, right? So like you said, I build from bottom up, so to speak, from texts. And if it comes to the point where the building gets large enough that it starts touching arguments about history and race and whatnot, that I can generalize, then I can make that move, right? But you're right. I think a lot of people don't start that way. I think for them, let's say a novel, a text, and the context that they're mixing it with or looking through, the historical lens or a theoretical lens, is just as important, just as weighty as the text itself, right? Yeah, those kind. So there's different ways I think you can make arguments and contextualize them so as to appeal the value of the argument you're making. But my way of doing it tends to create articles that have a narrower audience than an article that engages with theory, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, that's very useful as well. All right, I wanted to ask you just a final big question before we close. I'm gonna later ask you just general advice to people in early career. But before that, just another big one about the stage you're in right now, right? So you're still trying to turn the dissertation into a book. What are the challenges? What are you most what are you struggling with the most right now, right?
I'm struggling with a lot of things. It's hard to say just one. So one thing that I really need to sort of give up is this desire to include everything, So there is this perfect book that I have in mind that incorporates all the important ideas I think that should be a part of this book, right? But at the same time, you have to be aware of the fact that most first books by early scholars that come out from university presses and academic presses are somewhere like 300 pages, maybe 10,000 words, 11,000 words max, right? So you can't have everything in there, right? So I need to make my argument convincing, but without being so verbose and reliant on, providing evidence. That's been a main source of maybe anxiety, and also the reason why it's taking me so long to finish the book, right? I just can't let go of a lot of the ideas that I really want to incorporate. But at this point, I've decided that I'm just going to write another book after this on Twain. So that makes me feel a lot better about cutting stuff out, right? So just kind of concentrate on what exactly I want to argue in this book, and then everything that is important but is not necessarily central, I'll just turn it into a different project, right? So that's kind of the one thing that I am struggling with. Another thing is that the fact that because the nature of my argument changes as I work on my book, right? From the dissertation to the book, I have to go look for scholarship that I didn't really look into very deeply for the dissertation, right? So I just keep having to adapt to how my work changes in terms of the scholarly context that I want to work within. right? And then there's the added problem of the fact that every year new stuff comes out, right? And then finally, another one is that I really feel that my dissertation has gotten my book has gotten a lot better because I've taken a lot of time to revise. So there's no doubt it's better, right? But I've also had to basically do a lot more research into contextual stuff. Like, so for example, I'm now working with the popularity of word games in 19th century US and humor in the context. That means I have to basically go into humor studies, right? And learn about things like rebuses and charades and stuff like that, right? Specific genres. And so that sort of knowledge about different genres, or I'm also working with the history of how what they call Egyptomania. In 19th century, ancient Egypt became really popular. It's like a cultural fad because of the decoding of the Rosetta Stone. And Twain was very interested in Egypt and hieroglyphics, and that's part of the decoding and cipher. It's a part of his interest in decoding and ciphers, and so I had to go in. So that kind of thing, you know. So as you look deeper into the topic, it ends up just connecting with different historical and cultural moments and contexts that I just have to keep updating myself with. And so that just slows everything down. But all in all, I mean, those things are kind of hard. And it is very frustrating, you know, that I can't just finish and let it go. But I mean, it's my first time, right? Writing a book and revising for a book. So, you know, I think I'll be okay in the end. Another really worrisome thing, it's not really a problem yet, but is that since I don't basically have anyone around me that publishes in the American book publishing world, I don't really know where to go for advice. Right. I mean, I'll contact my chair and my committee, but you know, it would be helpful if there were some resources or people that I could ask advice from in terms of how to, let's say, write a proposal, right? Mm-hmm. Or how do I contact an editor other than like cold emailing them, right? Is it even, you know, important to email editors and stuff like that, like the nuts and bolts, right? So that resource is not a part of the sort of place that I'm in right now. So that is something that I'm worried about right now. Right. Yeah. So those. I
mean, I do know that at least here, what I've seen is that sometimes publishers do workshops themselves, right? So yeah. I've seen that there's a more, you know, not super prestigious publisher, Peter Lang, has done workshops here. So the general editor comes and tells you, like, you know, here's how you prepare proposals for us. Here's what we're looking for, etc. Right? So maybe that's I don't think that's a thing that's very common though. I've never heard of such a thing happening in the States, for example, of like publishers going out of their way to, you know, so maybe it is something that departments should maybe incorporate in their in the way they prepare people for the job market and for the future, right? Because now I know that.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry. No.
Now I know that at least in Buffalo they are doing like publishing workshops, right? Like how to get an article published, and definitely this issue of like how to turn your dissertation into a book is, you know, very important, because I don't think at least in Europe, I'm not sure about the States. I think it's still possible for you to get your first job with just a bunch of articles. But I think it's increasingly more common for you to need, a first book or a first book contract at least, in order for you to get a job, right? So that is a very important thing, right? Like how to, progress from one stage to the other.
Yeah, I agree. Buffalo, when we were in Buffalo, they actually had a how to turn your dissertation into a book workshop. A editor from SUNY Press came over. But what I realized at this point is that it was useful to talk, but it's like you haven't really revised dissertation into a book. So what the editor is saying didn't really stick,
Right.
So I feel like what is really needed for this revision process is a kind of a late stage mentor. You're in the revision process, you're seeing the goal, right? You're almost there, and or just like you're in the midst of the process, right? And there are things that you confront that you only see when you're in the midst of it, right? Rather than like when you're still writing your dissertation, they tell you, well, when you're done, you can do this or that, right? So I would really appreciate, I don't know how this would work, but I would really appreciate mentorship for early scholars who are currently revising their dissertation into a book. And there's resources like that. Penn State has a whole sort of a program, a kind of a fellowship for scholars who are writing their first book. I think it's called the First Book Institute, right? And there's also, YouTube videos with editors from university presses that tell you how you should do your revision, so I do look at those kind of things, but then again, those are YouTube videos. And so it doesn't really help. I'm not really sure if, I'm just supposed to take their advice at face value and just do whatever they're saying, right? I'm not really sure what the criteria for selection of the resources is. Yeah, so that's something that is definitely something that I would appreciate seeing more of.
Right.
So, yeah.
All right. So before we go, just I wanted you to try to think of things that you might want to say to people that are in this early stage of the career that think are crucial, right? To get published, to get a job. What advice would you give to
them?
someone at this stage?
You mean this stage as in right after getting their PhD?
Yeah,
or right around?
Yeah, so let's you're finishing the PhD, which is I expect our audience to be more or less at that stage. You're finishing your PhD, you're trying to get your first job, get your first book published. You're trying to get your also your first like major article, major publication out. What advice would you give to or what was useful to you, right? To know, right, when you were, you're still kind of are, even though you are, you have a job and whatnot, but you're still more or less at this early stage of your career, right? What is useful to you at this point that allows you to do like good work and original work and whatnot? What do you think is most important to know and to do?
Okay. All right. I think one of the most important things that I did that paid off was that I was very practical about what I needed to do to find a job after getting my PhD, right? I did a lot of research about the criteria that the Japanese job market upholds when they hire someone entry level. Right? So in Japan, you need 3 articles at least for you to get an entry level permanent job. So just right off the, right as I started the PhD, I knew that I needed to publish as I was going through the PhD program, right? So that made me very practical in terms of how I behaved throughout coursework. Most of my peers took coursework as a kind of just a class, right? Something that like hurdles that they were jumping through to get to the end of the process. For me, the coursework was an opportunity to engage with texts that along with a specialist, a professor, right? And then write about that text and get feedback, right? And so that I can turn it into a publication, right? In other words, I was always taking a class thinking, can I turn this essay, right? Or can I turn this experience into a publication? And I did. I think I wrote 2 articles based on my coursework. An essay that I wrote in these classes. All because, not really because I wanted to publish, right? But because I had the goal of finding a job at the end of the PhD in mind. So my advice would be, one, be very aware of the market that you are going on. Is it going to be the US market? Is it going to be a market outside of the US? Is it going to be British, Japanese, I don't know, Portuguese, whatever, right? Research that market, know what you need to get a job, right? And then prepare for it right off the top of the bat when you enter the program, right? Because when you start preparing after you've half written your dissertation or whatnot, you're going to be really stressed, right? Because, you're going to have to do things that should take years, but be asked to do that in like a year or like 6 months or something, because you need to find a job, right? But if you know ahead of hand, you can prepare better and hit the market with good credentials that would actually translate into a job. And to address the issue of what can you do to, have more time to do research and write, the best thing to do is to find a job, right, in academia, right? The only reason I wanted to get a PhD and to get into this, this academic position is because from start to finish, I wanted more time to engage with literature, right? It wasn't anything else, right? And, it doesn't take long to realize that if you're someone who wants to read and write about literature as much as possible, then getting a job in that area is the best way to do it, right? So, so I would definitely have a practical mindset coupled with research about the market that you are heading into, right? That's one. And another thing, and this might not be what you're looking for, is to try to be healthy. Maintaining health is really important, right? So, and that's one of the things that a lot of, I think, PhD students neglect, right? And also early career scholars, I think, because there's a lot of pressure to publish. But if you're not healthy, both mind and body, it's gonna be hard to produce, and think well. And I was, I neglected my health throughout most of my dissertation process, and I kind of broke down physically towards the end. And if I were to go back and talk with myself, I would tell myself to treat yourself better, right? Because in the end, you're going to your efficiency is going to really suffer if you don't feel good, right? So feeling healthy, treating yourself better, good thing, right? Sleep 8 hours rather than 3 hours, and stuff like that. Yeah, and what else? Advice? I mean, one thing I realized is that, you know, as soon as you find a job and you finish your program, you're more or less isolated from people in the same stage in terms of career, like early scholars that are, as you said, starting to write articles that will be a major publication for the first time, or revising their books or something like that, right? Because you can't choose where you're going to find a job. So like me, I'm in Japan, but all my peers in the program are all over the world, right? And so when you land on the job, you know, you have duties, you have administrative work on top of your research, you teach a lot, right? So things move really quickly, and you really sort of, you don't have that sort of interaction with people in the same stage of your career that you had during the PhD program. So it's good to have, keep in contact with someone in the same career phase. So for example, I have a reading group that I started. It's not really a reading group, it's more like a reading pair because there's only two of us. So me and one of my peers started a reading pair when I was still in the program. And we're still doing it more or less every 2 weeks with stints of blanks. But yeah, consistent 2-week interval reading group, which has produced conference presentations, and in my case, articles, right? But it's mostly just to kind of keep in touch and talk about literature with someone that's in the same area, but has a different perspective. And it kind of lets you sort of maintain your sort of passion for research that kind of you're forced to put on the back burner when you are mired in teaching and administrative work. So yeah, find a community or make one. It doesn't have to be, you know, a lot of people. It's just, you know, someone that you can you feel comfortable with, and you can talk about research and stuff like that on a periodical basis. That I think really helps in the long run. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much. I think that's all very useful. And I will just say that, you know, the video will be up for a couple of months, and then we'll have the audio removed. And that's all. I mean, next month I'm gonna have a chat with another early career researcher about the same things, you know, writing practices, research methods, and whatnot. So thank you very much, Shosuke. And you know,
yeah, thanks.
Gotta finish that book.
Yeah, great talking. Yeah, I'll let you know when it's done.
All right, thank you.